Hello, good morning. This is the UNESCO Chair for Art and Architecture, Constructive Cultures and Sustainable Development. We're going to have the first lecture of this year on Paul Oliver legacy. Well, here on my left, you know him, or most of you know him, is Marcel Vellinga, professor and main disciple of Paul Oliver. Paul Oliver was a very dear person in this university. He was here several times and he lectured, and we have even beyond that a good friendship with him. So we're very proud to make this kind of tribute to him and to have the best person to do it, probably Marcel Vellinga, who is the professor at the Oxford Brookes University, and being here for a workshop with the students that you are there. Okay, thank you very much, Marcel, for accepting to give this lecture, and go ahead. I just tell you that there are some Spanish students who are going out in a while, so there will be people entering. I'm sorry for that, but they wanted to come, but they're coming a little late. Okay, don't worry about that.
Okay. Does this work? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Do you mind if I stand up? No? Yeah. Because I don't like to sit down here behind this table. Okay. So thank you very much, Fernando. Great pleasure, as always, to be in Valencia. Great honor to be able to talk about Paul as well. In the university that, as you say, he was very fond of, and I think he came here several times. We're here with the students on the fourth joint field trip workshop, so that's great. Again, thank you for inviting us, thank you for hosting us, thank you for asking me to talk today as well. We'll know or know of him or have met him. So, opportunity just to say a few words. Sadly, Paul passed away last August in 2090. So it's what I'll be talking about today. First of all, so I'll start off saying a little bit about Paul, saying a little bit about his legacy, the work he's done, and how the work that he has done is University, focus in particular on the IART program. Give everybody a sense of how his work is particularly relevant in terms of what we are teaching. So in that respect, it's probably good that the students come at the second end, so they get the interesting bit for them about the teaching activities. That we're here in Valencia for this week actually is very much inspired by Paul Oliver, and a lot of the things that we talk about, a lot of the things that we investigate, a lot of the things that we do, his example. If you Dartmoor, he was very fond the rocks that he's sitting on in this particular image of granite. So, and some of you will probably do that. A good more studying architecture, but not just vernacular architecture. I'll talk about that later. Architecture more generally as well. And he's published from the late 1960s onwards several books on vernacular architecture that may or may not have most well known to students as well as researchers. It's a more popular book, if you like, that talks about not necessarily in a house of some sort, which could be just a particular place without a construction happening. It could, and that book is an overview, if you like, of all the different ways in which people inhabit the world and the different types of habitations that they construct for themselves, the different meanings that come with those buildings, and which these point where they are. So what you see at the image is the second edition, dating back to 2003. Written a lot earlier, back in the 1980s. So there are two different versions of that one. Personally, I like the first one better than the second. I shouldn't say. You know, I think if you want to turn to dwellings, it wasn't the only thing he wrote, though. Even shelter, 60s and the early 70s. Shelter in Africa, symbol on shelter in Greece, which is very little known and much more difficult to get hold of. And in a sense, that those books are doing the same thing as Dwellings is attempting to achieve later on as well, is to try and make people aware of the different ways in which people live around the world, the different forms of and emphasize the value, the significance of different types of building traditions. So a lot of that is actually focused on vernacular architecture, and these days Paul is probably most remembered as architecture all around the world. But I think it's very important to realize that his book collection, for instance, included lots of modern architecture as well, modernist architecture. And so these other books, one on at the bottom left, for instance, I think is probably Roman. I don't know how many of you are aware of that particular book, which is about the suburban dwellings in the UK that were made during the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And it's a very detailed study, not just him, two other authors, trying to explore why those suburbs have such a negative reputation as they did among architects at the time, and as they do in the architecture field. Why do we look at the suburbs in the way that we do as these fascinating, and they have their own culture. They were a great improvement on the types of housing that people lived in before the suburbs were built. They are not all the same, even the suburbs as this generic kind of standard noddy houses, if you like. They are, in fact, very individual. Of their time, and people actually vernacularized them, if you like. They made them their own. Most of these 1930s suburbs that you see, for instance, those of you who know Oxford, they are all individual, if you like. Many of them are actually exactly the same. They have different decorations, different shapes, different size of windows. They're just slightly individualized. Hence the garden gnome on the cover of that particular book, because garden gnomes were something that, and they are an example for Paul as to how people actually individualize those suburbs, how they make them their own by adding garden gnomes or by changing the windows, having tainted glass, etc., etc. So that's a very nice general introduction to architecture. It's mentioned in there, but most of it is in fact about other types of architecture, industrial architecture, etc. For Paul, all of that, I think that's one of the of architecture. Now, when you look at his oeuvre, if you like, over the years, books he's written on recur. Still very much influence the way we teach at Oxford Brookes. So the first one is this quote from the Architecture and an Invitation book. It's not the prerogative of a few, nor the privilege of an elite. It is for all and by all. And by that he means that, or he meant that the architect, in his perspective, was way too limited in what it considered to be architecture. What is architecture? Asked. Is it simply the things, the buildings that are designed by the great architects of the time, the buildings that are designed for the wealthy, for the powerful, for the elite, the palaces, the mosques, the cultural centers, railway stations, etc.? Or is it in fact everything and anything that people build? Now for Paul, very clearly, it was the latter. You know, he didn't believe in the distinction. Lincoln Cathedral being architecture and the bicycle shed being. For Paul, both were architecture, but they into the functions that they have. But all of them, for Paul, emerged from the background, the cultural background, the social expectations of the people that build them. So yes, and bicycle like Lincoln Cathedral. And thinking that, as those of you who are cycling will probably know. So he was very much for this is designed by somebody I don't know and therefore we can discard it. No, as people interested in serious, better buildings or traditional historical buildings, whether they're grand buildings or and everyone has a right to have a say in what kind of built environment they live in, what kind of building. So that is a clear message that comes from all Paul's writings. And the second one then, which relates to that, is that in any society, this is just one quote, I mean he's written many times over, in any society buildings are generally the largest, frequently the most permanent, and often invested with the most profound meanings of any human artifact. So he kind of singles out architecture as the very special form of material culture. I think we can. The message here is that the building is not just a building that exists on its own, outside of a cultural, historical, social context, as an art object, if you like. It is an object that emerges from a social, cultural background, people's expectations, people's needs, people's values, people's beliefs, etc., all are embodied in that building. Again, be it a bicycle shed or be it a cathedral. And to realize that means that you can understand the building better, you can understand where it comes from, the way they do, and you can also, therefore, as an architect, respond better in situations, for instance, as we're facing here, where buildings are abandoned, or buildings need regeneration, or buildings need conservation, or new buildings need to be built. Don't just plonk a building right in the middle of a social historical context and study it as a piece of art. We should study it as a cultural artifact. So that was the second message that he continued to put forward, even in fact in his very at the RBA. And nowadays that probably seems quite common. We probably know that, we are aware of that. When Paul started to write about these things, surprisingly, it wasn't necessarily that much accepted, and therefore he felt very much the need to emphasize this again and again. So that was the second theme. So the first one is be more inclusive in what you mean. Is don't look at your objects as works of art that can be studied in terms of their form and their size and their materiality, but see them as an expression or an embodiment of cultural, historical context. The third one is that, in fact, and significance, they are, in fact, things that we can learn from, right? So there is much to be learned from the world's of men's solutions to the problem of. So even if we recognize that architecture is a cultural context, there is still a need for Paul to look beyond the building, to look beyond architecture, and to actually look at why do people build architecture. He used the term shelter in his earlier work. He kind of stopped using that later on. For Paul, the main reason why architecture existed was always shelter. People needed a roof above their head. They needed walls around them. They needed something to protect them from the environment, something to make them safe. And that for him was the main reason why people built. And that means therefore for Paul that when you're an architect, when you're a student of architecture, it shouldn't be just about this is a lovely building, I like it, or I don't really like the design of that building, that color is not really to my taste, or I think the form is too much of another building. No, it should be why do people have these buildings, and why is it, in fact, that some people do not have buildings that meet their needs? Why is there a problem around the world? Architecture purely for its aesthetic value, if you like, or its artistic value, or its design value. That as an artist himself. Ultimately, to housing and had access to housing that actually met their needs. Published in 1987, which was the United Nations Year of the Homeless. I think it was probably the first year that was done, and he deliberately made sure that the publication of dwellings coincided with that Year of the Homeless, because he wanted us to talk about the dwellings that people inhabit around the world, but ultimately for him it was about what can we learn from all these dwellings around the world. Billions of people around the world who live in poor conditions. So those were the key messages, if you like, of Paul Oliver's work. And all of those kind of then came together in his magnum opus. He's probably best known for, and the thing that he will probably be most remembered for in the architecture world, his Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture, which was published back in 1997. Time when it was published, it was a big, if you like. There were lots of people who contributed, around 750 from 80 countries around the world contributed to the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World. And it attempts, or it was the first, if you like, to provide an overview of what we know about all the different vernacular building traditions around the world, how they have been studied, and what lessons can be learned from them. So there are 3 volumes. Overall, there are 400 pages, I think. I have it somewhere that relevant. A huge piece of work made up of 3 different volumes. The first volume deals with the theory and the concepts and the approaches to vernacular architecture. So it deals with all the different disciplines that have studied vernacular architecture, anthropologists, historians, conservationists. Entries that deal with specific concepts that are central to what vernacular architecture is. There is aspects that influence vernacular architecture: religion, politics, economy, social structure, kinship, etc. There are sections, specific sections on materials and resources, all the different types of materials that people use around the world to build their dwellings: earth, timber, manufactured materials. On the different types of technologies that are used, the different structural systems. There are entries on the different symbolic messages that vernacular architecture, the shape, through the color, through the decorations, through inscriptions. There are domestic buildings, dwellings, to agricultural buildings to religious buildings, political kind of buildings. Architecture is, what its uses are, what its meanings are, what the ways are that they are built, and then entries on specific vernacular traditions from all around the world. So Asia, North America, Africa, everywhere there are entries of distinctive vernacular building traditions that kind of represent those parts of the world. Looking back at the encyclopedia now, it is in fact very impressive. It's impressive in the sense that it's the first attempt to actually Paul managed to contact and get about 700 the time when there was no computer, well, there were computers, but there were no internet. There was no email. Everything was done by hand, by typed or handwritten letter, etc. In addition to the regional entries, kind of descriptive entries, it also was the most comprehensive bibliography of vernacular architecture that existed. It included copies of key terms, key architectural terms that architecture translated into French, Spanish, Italian, I don't know, but there are about seven or eight languages. So it's a fundamental resource, and not a very developed field. With the emergence of the publication, with the publication of the encyclopedia, the field kind of entered a different kind of stage, if you like, where people look. This happens in Arizona. How does it happen in Kenya? Or why are things different in Alaska from the way they are in Ecuador, etc. So it kind of allowed for more to vernacular architecture. So it was a key moment, really. And as I said, that's probably what people will remember Paul for mostly, and probably rightly so. But the question then raises, how can somebody become so interested in vernacular architecture? How can somebody dedicate 10 years of his life after he's retired to creating such an encyclopedia? What was it that drove Paul to do all this? An influential scholar. So I thought I'll just say a little bit about his background, not in too much detail, but the things that I think influenced him to become the scholar. And they're interesting because they are, in respect, I suppose, still relevant. So Paul was born in Sherwood Forest, Robin Hood country, but he grew up in Dorset on the south coast. Close to a pool, where he spent his, younger years up until his mid-teens, after which he went to London, in fact, to the west of London, to Pinner. And he has written about and spoken about how the time in Simmonsbury actually really influenced him, because he saw a vernacular village that was still active. This was the 1930s. When the arts and the crafts, the local kind of traditions were still very much alive, and he's written about how he saw people, fixing fishing nets in front of their cottages, and he went to the local school and he saw the farmers and the peasants working, etc. And he grew up in this kind of traditional pastoral England, really, that people nowadays often kind of, long back for. He grew up in that, and that influenced him, the thatched cottages, the stone cottages, the earthen buildings, etc. But then he moved to London, and he did because his father was in fact an architect. Paul himself wasn't an architect. or not even, in fact, officially an architectural historian. But his father was an architect, and before the war, his father worked in the design of cinemas, which at the time was kind of at the cutting edge of, architecture, if you like, cinemas. Cinema was a big thing. The country wanted cinemas, and he designed those kind of grand cinemas. So Paul clearly influenced by that, and he often spoke fondly about his father and the office that his father had and the kind of buildings that he designed. But then, of course, end of the 1950s, the war breaks out, and Paul's father stops designing building and gets involved in the reconstruction efforts, and before that, in the kind of architectural work that was being carried out to support the war effort. So things like camouflaging, etc. And also documenting the destruction by German bombings. And so, in particular, he remembered very well that when he was 15, he went with his father to document the bombing of Exeter and the bombing of Plymouth. And as a 15-year-old boy, he kind of went there basically the day after the bombing to kind of document what has happened to the buildings, how can this place be rebuilt. And that made an impact on him, obviously psychologically, I think, also in terms of his realization how important it was for people to have a house, to have a home, to have a place that they could go back to. And he saw that the destruction of a home has a much bigger impact than maybe sometimes people realize. So he saw the clear connection between psychology and home, between having a place to live and to dwell, and the impossibility sometimes to dwell in a place that you would like to dwell in. So that connection between house and home, between needs and expectations and the types of buildings that we provide for people, the ability to provide housing to communities kind of really registered with him at that particular moment in time, and I think that you can see that later on in his writings when he tends to go back to the housing issue again and again. So that had a big impact on him, but then after the war, he doesn't go into architecture. He would like to study, but he can't, and he ends up studying art at Goldsmiths College in London. So in fact, Paul Oliver was an artist, even though he's often described as an anthropologist or as an architectural historian. He was in fact an artist, formally speaking, but in reality he was a bit of everything, I think. So he went to Goldsmiths and he studies art. So he produces art. It includes a bit of architectural history as well, and he becomes an art teacher. So he works in the school where he teaches art. He becomes a drawing master, as it's called. A draftsman. He gives lectures to the Tate Gallery and the National Gallery, etc. And then, I don't know the exact date, somewhere in the 1960s, he gets employed by the AA, the Architectural Association in London, to teach drawing to architecture students. And he likes that because his father was an architect. He has an affinity with architecture. He likes to draw. He likes to teach drawing. So he starts to work in the Architectural Association. That's where he then starts to engage with because what he does first, and this is something that not everybody is always aware of, what he does first is to study something completely different, something that I think was his first love, even though he would always say, no, I like them both. I think blues music was his big passion. And as a young man, again, during the war, he worked in a logging camp as a scout. He was just too young to join the war effort, but he was running a logging camp somewhere in somewhere in East Anglia. And next to that logging camp, where he was with a whole group of scouts chopping timber for the war effort, there was an American air base. And on that American air base were black African-American soldiers who were singing in the evening. So he described it in his books, his blues books, about how he heard these sounds, and he didn't know what it was. He was listening to, I don't know, the kind of music that was popular in the UK at the time, Bing Crosby and the English kind of type of, music. And he heard these. A friend of him took him and said, "Come on, let's go and have a look." So they went. Who these guys were? There were these African Americans. They were making these sounds. They didn't know what it was, and his friend said to him, "You're listening to the blues." That's how he has described it later on. And then he says, actually, it wasn't the blues. It was They were the kind of songs that the African American slaves used to sing whilst working, right? The kind of working songs. For those of you who've seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou and films like that, you know, the chain gangs and the kind of songs that they sing. They were singing this music. So during the war, whilst they were there, they started to exchange records. Paul had records of all the English musicians that were popular at the time. The African American soldiers had records of blues singers, and they started to exchange them. So I give you Bing Crosby, you give me, you know, Robert Johnson, or whoever these guys were. And he got fascinated in that. And then after the war, he began to study this type of music. Where did it come from? How do people, you know, where does this music emerge from? It's so different from what I'm used to in the UK. He studies it, and he produces a book, The Story of the Blues, in 1959, which is the first book, if you like, that was written about the history of the blues by a white scholar, and outside of America as well. I think there was one guy who wrote about the blues earlier. I'm not an expert on his blues work, but he was one of the first people to write about the blues. He created an exhibition about the blues and about the musicians whose records he collected in the American Embassy in London. And then the American Embassy gave him a grant to travel to the United States and study the blues. So off he goes with his records and with the names and the photographs of these guys on the covers, and he starts to travel with his wife through the American South, which at the time was very segregated, very difficult place to travel, trying to hunt out, who are these guys, where are they, have you seen this guy, is he still singing, I'd like to interview him, I'd like to find him. He finds a lot of these African American artists in honky-tonk bars, sometimes homeless in kind of poor areas. He interviews them, he records their songs, he takes them back home, and he begins to write about the blues. And that is really what he did in the 1960s, really. He wrote about blues music. He wrote about 4 books, each of which was very influential. And if you check him out on the internet now, you'll probably find out about his blues work before you find out about his vernacular architecture work. A lot of people knew of Paul Oliver, who studied the blues, and they knew of Paul Oliver, who studied vernacular architecture, and they never realized it was actually the same person. And when you study his blues work, it's very interesting. He's effectively doing the same thing that he did with his vernacular architecture work later on. He says, we cannot understand this blues music just as a form of music. This music emerged from a social, historical, cultural context. And it slavery, he studied the conditions in Chicago and all the places in the Deep South, and he tried to connect the living conditions of the African American community with the music tradition. He studies the history of the blues, how it partly West Africa with the slaves who were transported to the United States, how it turned into this particular unique vernacular, if you like, music form of the Deep South, and how that music form then traveled, migrated with the African Americans to the cities in the north, where it developed this blues music. So it's very, very similar. And I think that if the blues had continued as a living tradition, he may well never have turned to architecture. But at the end of the 1960s, when the blues kind of took off in American as well as British in particular popular music, so we get the Beatles, we get the Rolling Stones, we get Claptons, etc., who are all making blues music, Paul kind of switches off. He kind of thinks, this is not the blues that I'm interested in. I'm not interested in commercialized versions by white popular bands playing the blues. The original blues singers, as far as he was concerned, kind of were no longer there. They were already old when he studied them. And he doesn't lose interest in the blues. He continues to research blues all the way up, in fact, till his death. More the history of the blues rather than as a contemporary art form. And he changes his attention to vernacular architecture. So from the late 1960s onwards, he travels around the world and he starts to study vernacular architecture. Again, with the same approach. You cannot understand these particular buildings just as art objects in themselves. They are part of a historical context. They are part of a culture. They express people's needs, their expectations, their beliefs. We need to understand that. He starts off in Ghana in the 1960s, and then he travels all around the world He does a lot of work in the United States on his blues trips. He kind of combines the blues and the architecture. He works a lot in Turkey. He works in Iran. And he travels all across Europe. And effectively, I don't know how many countries he's visited over the years. He was always traveling, for those of you who knew him, right up until a few years before his death. So he starts to build up this huge kind of overview of what vernacular architecture is, how people live, how it relates to their cultural backgrounds, how it relates to their social structure, etc. But again, just to emphasize, he wasn't just interested in the vernacular architecture, he also studies architecture. So at the moment we have his photographic collection. It includes a lot of these kinds of buildings as well. He saw those also as an expression of a particular society in a particular moment in time, in a particular place. And even though we may not call buildings vernacular in the sense as we often understand it, nonetheless function in exactly the same way. They are expressions, they are embodiments, if you like, of a culture and a society, and therefore he was interested in them all. And as I said before, he was very interested also in the kind of informal settlements, if you like, squatter settlements, the non-planned societies, the slums, whatever term we want to use it. Again, because of his experience during the war himself, where he could see how important housing was. So from the late 1960s all the way up until 2011, in fact, he traveled around the world. Wherever he went, he took photographs, he interviewed people, he studied the literature around the building traditions, he documented them. And all of that allowed him to then document that kind of vernacular architecture in the second half of the 20th century in his encyclopedia. But that then brings us up to now, because that Paul and all the contributors described in the encyclopedia, in many ways today is very different. So if you turn to the 1997 edition of Vernacular Architecture's encyclopedia, you find sometimes rather romantic description of these are those people and they live in this place and they have this culture and they build these types of buildings. The reality, of course, we know nowadays is that a lot of these vernacular traditions are very different. So in many parts of the world, vernacular architecture is abandoned, discarded, left to disappear, or already gone. In many places, it's romanticized. It's turned into this kind of touristy thing, and I think Valencia, and in fact, the baracca is probably a good example of that. We have the fridge magnets, we have the little models, etc., but we don't really have the baracas. But we have this nostalgic, melancholic kind of view of this is how life used to be. This is the architecture that is truly of this particular region. And then we have the things like you see on the right slide. We have the kind of new interpretations of what vernacular architecture is. The appropriations of them, contemporary design trying to reference something, etc., etc. And so actually at the beginning of the 21st century, I think you could say that vernacular architecture, as defined by Paul and his generation, actually finds itself in some sort of a predicament, because it's still there, but it's not really. How many of us live in architecture that we would consider to be vernacular? Quite limited, definitely in the Western world, many parts of the rest of the world as well. This architecture seems to be in a very difficult situation. At the same time, the concept has been challenged in itself. What do we mean by vernacular architecture? Why do we use a term like that? And in fact, Paul Oliver, from his very earliest writings onwards, is very critical about the term vernacular architecture. And he used to put it in inverted commas, because he said it's not really a good term. It doesn't really describe what we're talking about. It's architecture. So vernacular architecture finds itself in a bit of a difficult position, really, and that's, I suppose, what we're trying to deal with nowadays, then, really, for those of us interested in vernacular architecture or that kind of architecture. How do we approach this? Return to Paul and his legacy. Paul collected, whilst he was studying vernacular architecture, lots of literature. He took photographs wherever he went, and he compiled and kept most of his correspondence as well during that period. So after his death, that collection was merged into the Paul Oliver Vernacular Architecture Library, and housed at Oxford Book University. So Paul's entire collection, including his books, his own writings, his correspondence, his images, etc., are all in the university library and accessible to people. And altogether, I think it creates a fantastic resource, really, for people who are interested in vernacular architecture. And if you are, come to Oxford, go to the library. It's all there. It's all available for research. Books are sometimes unique, sometimes very standard. There may be books that you find in every library. There might be books that you find very hard. You struggle very hard to find anywhere. And having them all in the same collection actually makes it quite a unique little library of vernacular architecture. His correspondence, of course, is fascinating. His archive, it includes all his correspondence. So there's a whole file of letters going backwards and forwards between Paul and Amos Rappaport, for instance. Archive of his encyclopedia, all the correspondence, all the draft entries, all the images and the photographs that people send backwards and forwards, etc. They're all there and all ready for study. And in particular, there are his images. Now, Paul took, this is, I suppose, something to just think about, right? Contemporary day and age. I don't know how many photographs our students took on our 1-week field trip. Probably a lot more than Paul took in his entire career, but he took 25,000 images, photographs and slides, which doesn't sound a lot these days, but actually when you think that they date back all the way to the 1950s up until 2012, and they are from all around the world, it's actually quite an impressive archive of images of vernacular architecture all around the world. So we've digitized them all. We're in the process of cataloging them. They're all available online for free for anybody who wants to use them for research or teaching purposes. We had a little exhibition about it as well in the Pitt Rivers Museum. And this is one of the ways in which I suppose Paul's legacy lives on. There is the encyclopedia, there are his images, there is his archive, and there are his writings. So again, if you're interested, go to that particular URL and you get into the library and you can search images from wherever you want and use them for PowerPoints, to use them for your research, etc. But his legacy lives on in another way as well. At the moment we're busy editing the 2nd edition of Paul Oliver's Vernacular Architecture Encyclopedia. Camilla and Fernando, of course, are heavily involved with that as well. We're revising all the entries that were written. We're updating all the regional entries, but in particular we're updating the more theoretical entries around approaches and concepts, etc., because the world has moved on. We're 25 years almost since the first changed. Ideas have changed, theories have moved on, etc. And we're trying. Or in particularly, I think we've added 2 specific volumes that deal with issues that vernacular architecture faces in the 21st century. First of all, there's the whole issue of what we call sustainable development. Conflict. Wherever we look these days, there seems to be a conflict. It has a huge impact on vernacular architecture. It destroys vernacular architecture. It means that people abandon vernacular architecture. It also means that people create new forms of vernacular architecture using different traditions. It creates migration, forced displacement, which in itself means diffusion of building traditions. It means different building materials arrive in places that were hitherto not really in contact, etc., etc. So conflict is one of the things that is part of the sustainable development of these forms of vernacular architecture. There's environmental change. There's desertification, there's deforestation, there is coastal erosion, there is glacial melt, etc. All of these things have a huge impact on local vernacular traditions, and we're trying to document all that. There are huge population changes taking place. The kind of world that the first encyclopedia documents, the idea of this is Valencia, people build a baraka, and it's unique to that particular part of the world. Those types of entries no longer really fit the reality. Many parts of the world, cultures have dispersed. Different cultures have been in contact with each other. Migration is a huge issue all around the world. Deruralization is a big issue. Urbanization, most people have left the countryside by now. and moved into cities, leaving abandoned countrysides, resulting in new forms of vernacular architecture in cities, including informal settlements, etc. In certain parts of the world, there is a move back into the countryside, gentrification, etc. All these processes we're trying to capture in the sustainable development entries. And then there's also a new section on what we call the consumption of vernacular architecture. So the ways in which vernacular architecture is appropriated. For instance, through fridge magnets, which Camilla and Fernando have written about. You know, we see barracas in the tourist shops in Valencia. We struggle to see them actually in real life. But these appropriations of vernacular architecture are very interesting in themselves. Governments appropriate vernacular architecture, tourist boards appropriate vernacular architecture, NGOs appropriate vernacular architecture, architects appropriate vernacular architecture. Architects get inspired by them. They design new buildings like the one you see in the corner, which is an Indonesian building built in the Netherlands in the 21st century by an architect who has only visited Indonesia once for 10 days, for instance. He calls it inspiration. He's inspired by the vernacular. We might say he's appropriating a vernacular that he doesn't understand. But these things are happening all the time. People are representing vernacular architecture through films, through music, through media, social media. All of these things we're trying to capture, right? So it's not to do with how is vernacular architecture built, what materials do they use, what technologies do they employ, but it's more about what do they take from it? How do they represent it? How do they make it something that, you know, they think is important for their identity? With vernacular architecture, once it has been produced. You know, we conserve it, we regenerate it, we represent it in tourist brochures, we appropriate it as a government to control particular populations or to stereotype particular groups of people, etc. All of that we're trying to catch. And that, I think, is very much in line with what Paul would have liked us to do as well. And then more in particular, of course, his ideas carry on in our team. So this is the master's program that we run, which developed out of a master's program that Paul Oliver used to run about 10, 15 years ago. International Architectural Regeneration and Development. This is why we are in Valencia right now. This is why our students are here. And this program looks at the inherited built environment, which includes vernacular architecture, but it's not exclusive to that. There's all kinds of inherited built environment that we inhabit. Industrial, modern, you know, urban, rural, vernacular, etc. It doesn't matter really what kind of name we give to it. But wherever we turn, we find a built environment that was already there before we were there. In some cases, those built environments are abandoned or they're in a situation where they're not really developing. So we try to take our students there and to try and see how can we regenerate these buildings. We're not talking about conservation, we're not talking about keeping them as they are or making sure that they don't disintegrate, etc. There's a place for that. Our program is more about regeneration. How can we somehow give these buildings a new lease on life? How can we give them a new function, a new meaning? What can we do to them to make them viable again? And more particularly, how can we use those buildings to transform the historic, social, cultural context that they're part of? So the program is really about the transformative potential of architecture, if you like. It's not about vernacular architecture or any form of architecture as just a passive building that has been designed by somebody and that sits there and that shouldn't change. It's about architecture as, in fact, an active process. Architecture changes all the time. And it changes as a result of changes in society, but it also contributes and can contribute to changing society. It can actually change people's lives. What we do with a building, it can change social relationships, it can change cultural values. So it's about that. How can we use the building to address a bigger social or cultural issue? So in the first semester, we then look at the theory, we study the relationship between architecture and culture, we look at different techniques of regeneration, the history of regeneration, the theory of regeneration, we look at the kind of historical layering of society. We challenge the students to think, to be critical, a little bit differently, to not just approach a building as an object from the past, But that's something that has a right to change and that will need to change in order to remain relevant. And then in the second semester, we have the field trip this year here to Valencia, where the students do research. They try to get a sense of the buildings that we're dealing with, but more particularly, they try to get a sense of the history of the place, the culture of the place, the social issues, the political problems, the economic developments that are taking place. And to then come up with a strategy, first of all as a group, as to how can these little buildings, or these individual buildings, sometimes they're actually quite big, contribute to addressing a particular issue that a region faces. So there's a group strategy, first of all, and then there is an individual project where the students are asked to design or to engage in a design project, or sometimes a research project, to work out in a lot more detail how we can. We've been to all places. The course is in its 11th. So for instance, we've been to Romania, and we go to different places every year because we want to make everybody aware that wherever you go, the situation is very different. So this is rural Romania, where we have buildings right in the middle of nowhere, really. The nearest town is 5 kilometers away, which is quite a long way. You know, very rural kind of countryside in Romania, with looks like a very urban community, with all the problems that come with it. So in the case of Romania, there was poverty, there was a lack of a sense of ownership, there was a dependency on people wanting the government to provide for them because of their kind of communist historical background, etc. And that left all these buildings, and in fact these apartment blocks, kind of in limbo. What do you do? What can you do to these buildings in order to not just regenerate the building and turn it into, say, a tourist hostel, but to actually do something to the building that might just transform living conditions of the people in that particular village. We went to Romania, we went to the Netherlands, we went to Cyprus, where the situation, northern Cyprus, Turkish-occupied Cyprus, where the situation was very different, where we had a post-conflict situation, where people had been living in villages that were not originally their own for more than 40 years. They didn't have ownership, they knew they didn't have legal ownership. They kind of realized that they didn't have moral ownership, they had no idea what to do with these buildings, they had no economy really to function, they were dependent on Turkey, they were kind of stuck, really. And the whole village was in tatters because of the war that took place back in the 70s, and they hadn't been able to reconstruct. What do you do in such a situation? You know, how can you do something to these old buildings to kind of try and make the place a little bit better? We went to Adamus as well, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, probably now, right? Which was very different again. 8,000, I think, in the summer, 1,000 people in this time of the year, seasonal labor, etc. How do you deal with that architectural heritage? And then, of course, this year we're back. This area just down the road in the Huertas, you know. We have vernacular landscape that is very familiar to a lot of people, a little baraka, but you know, you can see it is and what the reality of Valencia is, right behind it with motorways and high-rise buildings. What do you do with a lovely vernacular building like that? We turn it into a fridge magnet, great. We turn it into a restaurant, maybe, but not when it's like 20 meters from a motorway, probably. How do you deal with that kind of situation? So that's what we try to do. And in all of those projects, in all of the work that we do then, you can clearly see Paul Oliver's influence. We try to look at all buildings, from the baraka to the petrol station, or from, you know, the kind of war-torn domestic buildings in northern Cyprus to 1950 shopping malls in Rotterdam. We've looked at all these different buildings. They are all architecture, they are all expressions of a particular culture, society, they reflect a particular economy. They were all in a state of abandonment. What do we do with this? How do we address it? So there's the architecture for all idea there. We see it clearly as not just buildings in themselves. It's not difficult to look at that baraka and turn it into a really nice, refurbished, you know, tourist accommodation. But that doesn't necessarily actually address the bigger issues. So we see architecture as part of a bigger social, cultural context. Again, directly going back to Paul Oliver's writing. And then finally we see this architecture is maybe contributing something to the future. This is not just heritage that is left, that can be abandoned, that can be conserved, that can be remembered. These buildings can actually contribute something to the future. Maybe not the buildings themselves, but the technologies they embody or the materials that they use. Earth, I mean, you know, Valencia is a great example, the work that Camilla and Fernando do around earth and, you know, conservation of earth, but also the modern use of earth, the lessons to be learned from earth and architecture for contemporary design. Again, that is very much the kind of thing that Paul Oliver also spoke about. So if you want to know more about that program, I put the marketing brochure link at the bottom. I'm already run over time, right? So I was going to leave it at that, if that's okay. Yeah.